My name is Grace. I'm in my mid 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in offices where people believe they understood me within the first 5 minutes. Quiet, reliable. The kind of woman who takes notes, follows up, smooths things over. The kind who doesn't make trouble. If you had asked my coworkers who I was back then, they would have said I was solid, dependable, nice. The word ambitious rarely came up. Neither did dangerous. I dressed simply, spoke carefully, and stayed out of the emotional weather systems that seem to dominate corporate life. I wasn't invisible exactly, but I was easy to look past. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about humiliating anyone or about a dramatic downfall that makes for satisfying headlines. It's about something quieter and in many ways more unsettling: how power can be gathered slowly, almost accidentally, and how using it, even responsibly, can change the shape of your inner life. What you're about to hear happened over several years. It began with small moments that most people would forget by lunchtime. It moved through a period of observation and learning that didn't feel heroic while I was in it. And it ended with a decision that helped me rise professionally, but cost me something harder to name and harder to get back. I spied on my boss's computer and used his secrets to climb. What I learned gave me power. What I did cost me peace. I want to be clear about why I'm telling this now. Not to justify myself, not to warn you away from ambition, and not to pretend I was some flawless strategist who knew exactly what she was doing at every step. I'm telling it because stories like this usually get flattened, turned into morality plays with clear villains and heroes. Real life isn't shaped that cleanly. As you listen, you'll hear about how being underestimated can feel like safety until it becomes a cage. You'll hear about the temptation to stay quiet, then the temptation to use what quiet gives you access to. And you'll hear about a version of success that looks impressive from the outside, but feels strangely hollow when you're alone with it. This is a documentary-style account. Calm, honest, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations staged for applause. Just a woman looking back at who she was, who she became, and the line she crossed without fully realizing where it led. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. No need to answer yet. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that the thing giving you leverage was also slowly changing who you were? To them, I was easy. Not easy in the way people mean when they're being kind, but easy in the way furniture is easy. Useful, familiar. Expected to be there, never expected to speak. I joined the company in my late 20s, young enough to still believe competence would naturally lead to recognition, old enough to know better than to say that out loud. My title sounded important if you didn't know what it meant: Executive Operations Coordinator. In practice, I was the connective tissue. I scheduled meetings that other people took credit for running smoothly. I prepared documents that senior leaders skimmed and then presented as if they'd written them themselves. I remembered things no one else bothered to store in their heads. And I did it well, quietly, reliably. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table, not by instruction, just by habit. I spoke when asked, and when I did, I kept my voice even, my sentences efficient. I learned quickly that enthusiasm could be mistaken for insecurity, and confidence for threat. So I cultivated neutrality. It made people comfortable. People like to say no one noticed me, but that isn't quite true. I was noticed in the way support structures are noticed, only when something goes wrong. If a meeting ran late, it was my calendar. If a document had an error, it was my draft. If an executive forgot to follow up, it was my reminder that hadn't been strong enough. What I wasn't seeing was upward facing. When promotions came up, my name was followed by phrases like indispensable where she is, or too valuable to move. I learned early that indispensability is often just invisibility dressed up as praise. My boss at the time, Daniel, barely looked at me when he spoke. Not out of cruelty, out of certainty. He knew exactly where I belonged in his mental map of the office. I was a fixed object, a reliable constant, someone who made his work easier without complicating his sense of himself. And I let that perception stand, not because I lacked ambition, but because ambition requires energy, and energy draws attention. I had grown tired of explaining myself in rooms that were already decided against me. So instead, I listened. I watched. I learned the rhythms of the place, who spoke and who was echoed, whose mistakes were softened and whose were documented. There's a particular loneliness in being underestimated that doesn't come with overt disrespect. No one is cruel to you. No one tells you no outright. They simply don't consider you when decisions are made. You exist adjacent to opportunity, close enough to touch it, never invited to step into it. I didn't tell myself a story about injustice. That would have required anger, and anger would have demanded action. Instead, I told myself a story about patience, about timing, about how every system rewards those who understand it best. So I became very good at understanding the system. I knew which executives trusted which data. I knew who panicked before board meetings and who pretended not to. I knew where information lived and where it didn't. I wasn't ambitious in a loud way. I was ambitious in an archival way. To them, I was the woman who took notes. What they didn't see was that I remembered everything. There's a difference between being invisible and being ignored. Invisible people are unseen. Ignored people are seen and dismissed. I was the second. And being dismissed gives you access without scrutiny. People speak freely around you. They leave screens unlocked. They assume your presence is procedural, not perceptive. At the time, I didn't think of this as an advantage. It felt like a neutral fact of my working life, the way gravity feels neutral until you fall. If you had asked me then who I was to them, I would have shrugged and said, support. And I would have meant it. I wasn't pretending. I wasn't hiding a secret plan. I was simply occupying the role I'd been assigned, performing it well enough that no one questioned whether I might want another. That role would shape everything that came next. And the first time it was tested, it didn't happen loudly. It happened in a way so small that everyone else forgot it within minutes. Everyone else except me. After the meeting, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Hey, Grace," he said, already halfway turned away. "Next time, can you tighten the numbers on slide 4 a bit more? The client might push back." Of course, I replied. He smiled briefly, satisfied. The system is working as designed. That was the first small cut. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed something structural. I wasn't part of the story being told about success. I was part of the machinery that made the story possible. Over the next few weeks, similar moments surfaced, minor, forgettable. A comment about how I was great at details, a joke about how I kept everyone honest, praise that fenced me in rather than lifted me up. Each time I responded the same way, with composure, with competence, with silence. People like to imagine moments of realization as cinematic. A sudden flash, a sharp intake of breath. This wasn't that, it was cumulative. A pattern forming at the edges of my awareness. What unsettled me wasn't that I'd been overlooked once. It was how natural it felt to everyone else, how seamlessly my work could be reassigned without discussion, as if ownership had never existed in the first place. I began to notice how often Daniel spoke about his projects when referring to things I had built, how frequently he framed outcomes as personal achievements rather than collective ones. It wasn't malicious, it was habitual, the habit of someone accustomed to being credited, surrounded by people trained to let it happen. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't send follow-up emails clarifying authorship. I didn't correct him in meetings. Part of that was caution, part of it was pride, and part of it, if I'm honest, was curiosity. I wanted to see how far the pattern went. Once you notice the first cut, you start to see the blade everywhere, not because it's suddenly sharper, but because you've learned its shape. I began to watch interactions more closely, to track whose voices carried weight and whose ideas needed translation before they were accepted. And I began to understand something quietly unsettling. The system didn't punish disrespect when it was subtle enough. It rewarded those who took advantage of it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. I started keeping more detailed notes, not just about tasks, but about decisions. Who proposed what? Who approved it? Who later claimed it? Not to build a case, not yet, just to understand the ecosystem I was living in. At the time, I still believed that if I performed well enough, long enough, the imbalance would correct itself, that patience would be recognized, that fairness would eventually assert itself. That belief would not survive what came next. Because the first cut, once ignored, teaches people something dangerous. It teaches them that you will accept the next one. Disrespect rarely arrives as an event. It arrives as a rhythm. Once the first small cut went unchallenged, the pattern didn't escalate dramatically. It settled. It became routine, which made it harder to name and easier to excuse. Meetings followed the same choreography. I prepared. Others presented. Decisions were made using language I had drafted, sometimes word for word, spoken by voices that carried more authority simply because they belonged to different bodies. When questions arose, eyes turned to me, but only briefly. I was consulted like a reference manual, not a decision maker. Grace, can you confirm the timeline? Grace, what did the data say again? Grace will know. I always did. And every time, the answer left my mouth and landed in someone else's summary. At first, I told myself this was mentorship by proximity. I was learning what leadership sounded like, how confidence was performed, that someday I would speak the same sentences and be heard differently. But that someday kept moving. What made it complicated was that no single moment felt worth pushing back against. Each instance was too small, too polite, too easily reframed as collaboration. If I corrected someone, I risked seeming territorial. If I insisted on credit, I risked seeming insecure. And insecurity, I had learned, was remembered far longer than competence. So I adapted. I softened my language even further. I framed ideas as questions. I let others interrupt without reclaiming the floor. I told myself I was being strategic, that restraint was a form of intelligence. In truth, I was negotiating my own erasure in exchange for stability. Daniel especially came to rely on me in ways that felt almost intimate, though never equal. He forwarded emails without context and expected instant clarity. He asked for quick thoughts that turned into key talking points. He trusted my judgment deeply, but only in private. Publicly, he remained the architect. I was the scaffolding. What surprised me most was how normal it began to feel. The human mind is astonishingly good at adjusting expectations downward. Each time my contribution went unacknowledged, the absence stung less. Not because it hurt less, but because I anticipated it. I began to preemptively detach from outcomes. If praise came, it was a bonus. If it didn't, it confirmed the pattern. Either way, I stayed composed. Colleagues occasionally said things like, "You're so unbothered," or "I wish I had your patience." They mistook my quiet for contentment. I didn't correct them. Inside, something else was happening. I started to catalog moments, not emotionally, but analytically. I noticed how often Daniel spoke over others who disagreed with him, and how he leaned back when someone echoed his opinion. I noticed which executives he deferred to, and which he dismissed with charm. I noticed how often he left his laptop unlocked when stepping out for just a second. None of this felt important on its own. It felt like ambient information, office noise. But patterns once recognized are difficult to unsee. I told myself I wasn't being wronged, that this was simply how hierarchy expressed itself, that if I wanted more, I would have to ask for it directly, and that I wasn't ready to risk the consequences of that ask. There's a quiet rationalization that creeps in when you normalize disrespect. At least it's predictable. Predictability feels like safety when you've learned to operate within narrow margins. So I stayed. I stayed late. I fixed things before they broke. I made myself indispensable in ways that never threatened the story leadership told about itself. And in doing so, I taught the system exactly how much it could take from me without resistance. What I didn't yet understand was that by staying silent, I wasn't preserving peace. I was deferring conflict and letting it accumulate interest. The disrespect didn't escalate because it didn't need to. It had already been absorbed into the culture. It lived in the assumptions people made about who spoke, who decided, and who supported. And once disrespect becomes normal, it stops looking like something done to you. It starts looking like who you are. That was the most dangerous shift of all, because when a role becomes identity, questioning it feels like self-betrayal. And I wasn't ready for that yet. Not until I realized the role I had been playing wasn't accidental at all, but carefully, unconsciously assigned. There's a moment when you stop asking why this keeps happening and start asking what this says about the role I've been given. For me, that moment didn't come during a conflict or a crisis. It came during a performance review. Daniel sat across from me with a printed evaluation, his tone warm, practiced. He praised my consistency, my reliability, my attention to detail. He used the word backbone more than once. "You're someone we can always count on," he said. "You make everyone else better." I waited. He didn't mention growth. He didn't mention leadership. He didn't mention the responsibilities I had already taken on beyond my title. When I asked, carefully, about advancement, he leaned back slightly, thoughtful. "I just want to make sure we don't stretch you too thin," he said. "You're so good where you are." There it was, spoken kindly, framed as concern. The role is named and sealed. I wasn't being held back because I lacked ability. I was being preserved because my position served others too well. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. I began to see how the role extended beyond my job description. I was the stabilizer, the absorber, the one who caught the details others dropped and smoothed tensions before they surfaced. I was rewarded for being low friction, and low friction people are rarely invited to reshape the machine. Once I understood that, everything sharpened. Interactions replayed themselves with new clarity. The way my suggestions were welcomed was only when they aligned with existing plans. The way I was asked to sense check ideas, never to originate them. The way I was praised was for flexibility, never for vision. This wasn't personal, it was structural. Organizations assign roles the way families do, quietly, early, and with surprising permanence. Once you're cast as the responsible one, the helper, the calm presence, deviating from that script feels disruptive, even threatening. And I had been very good at my part. I didn't resent Daniel for this. In his mind, he was being fair, protective even. He saw me as someone whose value lay in constancy, not ambition. And I had given him no reason to think otherwise. That was the unsettling part. I had collaborated in my own containment. I realized then that if I wanted to change how I was treated, I would have to disrupt expectations. Not through confrontation, but through repositioning. And repositioning requires leverage. At the time, I didn't know what form that leverage would take. I only knew that performing my role perfectly would never earn me a new one. So I stopped performing it quite so perfectly, not outwardly. I didn't miss deadlines or withdraw support, but internally, I shifted my attention. I became less invested in being liked, more interested in being informed, less focused on smoothing outcomes, more on understanding how they were achieved. I started to notice what people assumed I didn't notice. Which conversations happened without me? Which ones happened because of me? Which decisions were documented and which lived only in inboxes and open tab? The role I'd been assigned gave me proximity without power, but proximity has its own advantages, if you know how to use it. At this point, I still believed I could navigate my way forward cleanly. That awareness alone would be enough. That I could adjust my posture and be seen differently. I was wrong, because awareness without action doesn't change roles. It only makes you more aware of how fixed they are. And the moment that finally forced me to act didn't come from ambition. It came from a quiet, almost forgettable day, when something shifted, not around me but inside me. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no email that changed everything, no moment anyone else would point to and say, "That's when it started." It was a Tuesday, overcast, unremarkable. Daniel was out of the office, traveling for a conference, and I was covering his administrative flow, something I'd done dozens of times before. Approvals, calendar adjustments, responding to internal requests he'd flagged as, "handle if I'm out." Mid-morning, an urgent message came in from finance asking for confirmation on a budget assumption tied to a client renewal. I knew the numbers. I'd prepared them. But the question required checking a supporting file Daniel had referenced weeks earlier. His laptop was on his desk, lid half open, asleep. I hesitated. Not because I wasn't allowed to use it, but because I'd been trained not to appear too comfortable with access. Still, this was operationally normal. He'd given me his password months ago in case of emergencies, and never revoked it. So I logged in. What I found wasn't shocking. It wasn't incriminating. It was simply revealing. His desktop was a mess of folders with names that meant nothing to anyone but him. Inside them were drafts of presentations, email chains, notes from meetings I'd attended. Only his versions told a different story. Credit reassigned, contributions reframed, decisions described in ways that subtly elevated his role and minimized others. What struck me most wasn't the self-promotion. It was the casualness of it, the assumption that no one else would ever see this version of events. As I navigated through files to find the budget support, I noticed patterns, repeated phrasing, talking points that appeared in his public communications days after I'd sent him internal summaries. My language, polished and repurposed. I didn't feel violated, I felt clarified. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a system. One I had been feeding on my silence. I found the file I needed, confirmed the numbers, and logged out. The entire interaction took less than 10 minutes. No lines crossed, no alarms triggered. But something inside me had recalibrated. I went back to my desk and opened my notebook, the one I always carried, the one people assumed was for reminders and to-do lists. On a blank page, I wrote a single sentence. Access is power when no one thinks you want it. For the rest of the day, I moved through tasks on autopilot. I answered emails, I joined calls, I nodded at jokes, but internally a line had been crossed, not ethically, but psychologically. I could no longer pretend I didn't see how the machinery worked. That night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. A deep, bone-level fatigue that comes from realizing you've been playing a game without knowing the rules, and suddenly understanding them all at once. I asked myself hard questions. Was this just how leadership functioned? Was my discomfort naive? Had I been complicit by allowing my work to be used this way? I also asked myself something quieter, more dangerous. What else could I see if I chose to look? That question didn't excite me. It unsettled me, because curiosity, once activated, doesn't stay contained, and access, once normalized, doesn't feel like trespassing. It feels like opportunity. I didn't decide anything that day. I didn't make a plan. I didn't tell myself I would act differently. But something fundamental had shifted. Silence was no longer just a habit. It was becoming a choice. And choices, once recognized, carry weight. I went to sleep that night knowing that nothing outward had changed, and that everything eventually would. Because once you understand the role you've been playing, and the power you've been sitting next to, continuing exactly as before is no longer neutral. It's a decision. After that day, nothing changed on the surface. That was the most unsettling part. Daniel returned from his conference energized, full of anecdotes and half-formed strategies. Meetings resumed their familiar rhythm. My calendar is filled. My inbox swelled. To anyone watching, I was the same Grace I had always been. Efficient, agreeable, quietly indispensable. But inside, silence had acquired texture. Before, my quiet had been instinctive, a default. Now it was deliberate. I noticed when I chose not to speak, when I let a moment pass without correction, when I allowed someone else's version of events to stand. Each time I felt the weight of that choice. I began to understand how easily silence could be misread. People saw it as compliance or modesty or lack of interest. They didn't see the calculation underneath, the way I was watching patterns repeat, watching assumptions solidify. Daniel, especially, grew more relaxed around me. He spoke freely, sometimes carelessly. He forwarded drafts with comments like, "Fix this however you think best," trusting that my edits would align with his intent. He stopped checking certain details altogether. Trust, I realized, is often built on asymmetry. The more I handled, the less he noticed how much I handled. And the less he noticed, the more access I had. Not just to files, but to context, to rationalize, to the quiet reasoning that never makes it into official records. I didn't exploit this. Not yet. I observed it. I started keeping a second set of notes. Not copies, records, timelines, decision trees, versions of events as they happened, not as they were later described. Ooh, I didn't share them. I didn't store them anywhere visible. They were for me. This wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. I noticed how often Daniel's public confidence was built on private uncertainty. How frequently he asked for reassurance before presenting decisions as inevitable. How much of his authority relied on others not comparing notes. None of this made him a villain. It made him human. But it also made the hierarchy feel thinner, more performative than I'd once believed. Silence, in that context, became a kind of currency. The less I reacted, the more people assumed there was nothing to react to. The more they assumed that, the more they revealed. Colleagues vented to me without caution, shared frustrations, forwarded emails, just so you know. I listened without offering solutions, without aligning myself publicly with any side. People project trust onto stillness. What surprised me was how the strategic quiet began to change how I felt about myself. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting revenge. But I was no longer naive. The office felt less like a workplace and more like a system of incentives, each one nudging behavior in predictable ways. And I was finally mapping it. There were moments when I considered speaking up, when a correction would have been easy, when claiming authorship would have been justified. Each time I asked myself, to what end? Correcting the record would have earned me momentary recognition and long-term resistance. It would have disrupted comfort without changing the structure. I wasn't interested in disruption for its own sake. I was interested in repositioning. So I stayed quiet, and they mistook that quiet for weakness. I could see it in how Daniel assigned tasks, assuming I would always say yes, how colleagues interrupted me without apology, in how decisions were finalized without my input, then routed to me for execution. The irony was almost elegant. The more underestimated I became, the more room I had to see clearly. Still, there was a cost. Holding silence consciously is different from being naturally quiet. It requires restraint. It creates distance between what you observe and what you express. At home, I found myself replaying conversations, not emotionally, but strategically. What had been said? What hadn't? What had been assumed? I wasn't sleeping poorly. I wasn't stressed. But I was alert, awake in a way that made rest feel provisional. Silence had stopped being a refuge. It was becoming a tool. And tools once recognized as such invite use. The moment I truly understood what they had never noticed about me came slowly, over weeks of watching, listening, and recording. And when that understanding settled, preparation began. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a quiet precision that surprised even me. What they never noticed was that I was smart. It was that I was patient in a way that didn't look like waiting. By the time I began preparing, no one thought of me as someone who prepared for anything beyond logistics. I was the person you trusted to remember dates, not trajectories, outcomes, not leverage. That misunderstanding created space. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to gather power. I simply started organizing what I already touch every day. Information has weight, but only when it's arranged. Loose facts are harmless. Patterns are not. So I began with patterns. I mapped decision cycles, how long it took for ideas to move from private doubt to public certainty. I noted which executives changed their language after speaking with Daniel and which didn't. I paid attention to what was documented formally and what lived only in emails, chats, or open browser tabs that disappeared once decisions were announced. I noticed how often alignment was achieved not through consensus, but through exhaustion, how objections softened when timelines tightened, how urgency was used to bypass scrutiny. None of this required spying, it required proximity. My role put me at the intersection of calendars, files, and follow-ups. I saw which meetings were added quietly and which were conspicuously missing. I noticed that when numbers were revised without explanation, assumptions shifted between versions. And I noticed something else. Accountability was selective. When outcomes were good, ownership was clear. When they weren't, responsibility diffused quickly, spread across teams, timelines, and circumstances. Memory became convenient. So I built my own. I created private timelines of major projects. Who proposed what when concerns were raised, how they were resolved or ignored. I kept original drafts and final versions, noting the changes between them. I didn't alter anything. I didn't intervene. I just preserved. This wasn't paranoia or revenge. It was self-defense, though I didn't name it that yet. What surprised me most was how easy it was, how little resistance there was to careful observation. People assumed that because I wasn't ambitious for myself, I wasn't ambitious at all. They didn't imagine I might be building context rather than clout. Daniel continued to trust me implicitly. He shared more, not less. Asked for feedback he didn't always follow, but clearly valued. He spoke openly about pressures from above, about expectations he felt trapped by. I listened without judgment. In doing so, I began to see the fault lines, not just in him, but in the organization, where compliance was rewarded over accuracy, where speed mattered more than truth, where silence was mistaken for loyalty. I also began to notice myself changing. I was no longer emotionally invested in being seen as good. I was invested in being accurate, in understanding consequences before they happen, in anticipating shifts rather than reacting to them. Preparation, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like diligence, like organization, like someone doing their job a little too thoroughly. And because of that, no one questioned it. There were moments when I wondered if I'd gone too far, not ethically, but psychologically. If this level of awareness were sustainable, if it was hardening me in ways I didn't fully recognize. But each time I considered stopping, something small would happen. A decision reframed, a contribution erased, a narrative adjusted after the fact, and I would keep going. What they never noticed was that my quiet had evolved. It wasn't passive anymore. It was directional. I wasn't collecting information to expose anyone. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was building optionality, the ability to move without asking permission. Optionality is a form of power that doesn't threaten until it's used. By the time I realized what I had assembled, it was already substantial, not explosive, not scandalous, but precise. I knew where inconsistencies lived. I knew which assurances contradicted private doubts. I knew which risks had been acknowledged internally and dismissed externally. And most importantly, I knew that if I ever needed to speak, I wouldn't be speculating. I would be citing. The clarity that came with that knowledge was sobering. It stripped away the last of my illusions about fairness being automatic. It also stripped away my sense of innocence. Because once you know what you know, and know that others don't realize you know it, you are no longer neutral. You are positioned. The private reveal wasn't a single file or message. It was the moment I understood exactly what kind of leverage I had been sitting on. And when that understanding arrived, there was no celebration, only a stillness that felt a lot like standing at the edge of something you can't unsee. The private reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, this is it. It arrived quietly, the way understanding often does, fully formed only after you've already been living inside it. I was reviewing a set of documents late one afternoon, reconciling notes from a leadership meeting I hadn't attended. The task itself was routine, align the written summary with what had been decided. But as I compared versions, early drafts, internal emails, calendar notes, I noticed something that made me stop. The official narrative didn't just simplify the discussion, it contradicted it. Concerns that had been raised clearly were absent. Risks that had been acknowledged in private were reframed as hypothetical. A decision that had been rushed was presented as unanimous and well considered. Individually, these discrepancies were easy to dismiss. Collectively, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. I sat there longer than necessary, not moving, letting the realizations settle. What I had wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't scandalous. It was something more subtle and more powerful. Proof of how truth was reshaped as it moved upward. And I had it because no one thought to hide it from me. My access hadn't changed. My behavior hadn't changed. Only my awareness had. I understood then that leverage doesn't have to be explosive. It doesn't have to destroy reputations or end careers. Sometimes it simply allows you to speak with a credibility others can't easily dismiss. I also understood something else, less comfortable. If I ever chose to use what I knew, I wouldn't be able to pretend it was accidental. I would be stepping out of the role that had protected me and into one that would expose me. That night, I went home and didn't open my notebook. I didn't review timelines or replay conversations. I made dinner. I sat on the couch. I let the quiet exist without trying to fill it. Power, when you first recognize it, feels heavy, not exciting, heavy with implication. I asked myself what I wanted, not in terms of title or compensation, but in terms of integrity. Did I want recognition or autonomy, visibility or influence, justice or control? The answers weren't clean. I knew I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want to win at someone else's expense. But I also knew I couldn't go back to being the person who pretended not to see. The reveal wasn't about Daniel specifically. It was about the system that had allowed him and others to operate without contradiction. A system that relied on people like me staying silent, staying helpful, staying unseen. I realized then that the leverage I held wasn't about exposing wrongdoing. It was about choice. I could stay, continue performing my role, and let the knowledge sit unused, like a locked door I never opened. Or I could use it to change my position within the structure, even if that meant unsettling the balance that had kept me safe. Neither option felt clean. Both had consequences. What surprised me most was the absence of excitement. There was no sense of triumph, only clarity, and with it, responsibility. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. Not friends, not colleagues, not even myself, fully. I carried it quietly, testing how it felt to know without acting. For a while, that was enough. But knowledge doesn't stay dormant forever. It presses. It asks to be integrated into how you move through the world. And eventually, it forces a decision. The decision point didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as an opportunity, one that would look from the outside like a natural next step. From the inside, it felt irreversible. The decision point didn't feel dramatic because it didn't look like a choice. It looked like timing. A restructuring was announced in an all-hands meeting, framed as optimization, alignment, the usual language that softens uncertainty. New roles would be created. Some responsibilities were redistributed. Leadership emphasized agility, trust, and accountability. I listened carefully, not to what was said, but to what wasn't. Daniel's posture changed when the slide about cross-functional ownership appeared. He nodded too quickly. I recognized the tell. This was something he hadn't fully anticipated. In the days that followed, conversations multiplied. Side meetings, clarifying emails, quiet questions routed through me because I was the one who knew how things really worked. And then, almost casually, an opportunity surfaced. A new position, still undefined but clearly influential, was being discussed. It would sit between operations and leadership, consolidating oversight, reducing friction. Someone would need to step into it quickly, someone who already understood the workflows and had the trust of multiple teams. Daniel mentioned it to me in passing. They're thinking of creating a role that pulls a lot of what you already do into one place, he said, scrolling through his phone. Might be a stretch, but you'd be a natural fit in terms of execution. Execution. Not leadership, not a strategy, execution. But the role, as described, would give access, authority over process, a voice in how decisions were documented and communicated. I went home that night and sat with the knowledge I had been carrying. I knew where the inconsistencies were. I knew how narratives shifted. I knew which risks had been minimized and which concerns had been quietly sidelined. I also knew that if I stepped into this role without changing anything else, I would simply be formalizing the work I already did, still invisible, just with more responsibility, unless I did something different. The irreversible choice wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about how I would position myself. I could apply quietly, accept the role as framed, and continue protecting others from the consequences of their decisions. Or I could step forward with conditions, with clarity, documentation, and a different definition of accountability. That would mean using what I knew, not publicly, not aggressively, but precisely. I didn't sleep much that night, not from anxiety, but from calculation. I walked through scenarios, not emotionally, but structurally. What would change if I spoke up? What would remain the same if I didn't? By morning, I understood something that felt both empowering and sad. There was no way forward that didn't cost me something. If I stayed silent, I would keep my peace, but sacrifice growth, integrity, and eventually self-respect. If I acted, I would gain influence, but lose the protection of being underestimated. Underestimation, I had learned, is a kind of shelter. I scheduled a meeting with Daniel, not to confront him, not to accuse, to clarify. I brought no printed evidence, no timelines, no records. I didn't need to. What I had was alignment between my understanding of the system and the moment it was shifting. I spoke calmly. I asked questions that revealed gaps without naming them. I described the role as I understood it, then outlined what it would require to function responsibly. Clear documentation, transparent decision trails, authority to question assumptions before they become outcomes. Daniel listened more carefully than he ever had before. He didn't agree immediately. He hesitated, asked what had prompted this level of concern. I answered honestly, but not completely. I've seen how things break, I said, and how easily that gets rewritten later. If I'm going to hold this responsibility, it needs to be real. There was a long pause. In that pause, I felt the line I was crossing. The shift from support to scrutiny, from quiet to consequential. When Daniel finally nodded, it wasn't enthusiastic. It was measured. Let me think about it, he said. I left his office knowing that, regardless of his answer, something fundamental had changed. I had made myself legible as someone who saw. And once you do that, you don't get to return to invisibility. That was the cost I accepted. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because living with unused clarity had become more expensive than the risk of acting on it. What happened next looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. No announcement, no sudden shift in how people treated me, no visible change in my title or where I sat in meetings. If anything, the days after my conversation with Daniel felt strangely ordinary. That was intentional. When you decide to move in silence, the first discipline is restraint, not just in speech, but in posture, timing, and expectation. I didn't follow up on our conversation. I didn't ask for reassurance. I let the idea sit where I'd placed it, uncomfortable, unresolved. Meanwhile, I began making small, legal, entirely defensible adjustments to how I worked. I started documenting everything more formally, not aggressively, just clearly. Meeting summaries included rationale, not just outcomes. Decisions were timestamped, attributed, and archived in shared spaces rather than private folders. Assumptions were labeled as such. No one objected. Why would they? Transparency sounds virtuous until it limits flexibility. At first, this looked like efficiency, professionalism, good process. Daniel even thanked me once. "This is helpful," he said. Keeps things clean. Clean, yes, but no longer malleable. I didn't frame these changes as protective or corrective. I framed them as risk mitigation, as scalability, as best practice. Language matters when you're changing systems quietly. At the same time, I began repositioning myself externally. I spoke a little more in meetings, not more often, just more precisely. When I did, I referenced documented context, not opinion. I asked clarifying questions that made implicit decisions explicit. Again, no resistance. People rarely push back against clarity when it's delivered without ego. Daniel's behavior shifted subtly. He became more careful about what he said in passing, more deliberate about how he framed decisions, not defensive, alert. I could feel the system adjusting around me, compensating for a new variable it hadn't accounted for before. Still, no one suspected a motive. That's the advantage of consistency. I hadn't changed who I appeared to be, only how much structure I gave to what I already did. To anyone else, this looked like growth, not a threat. Behind the scenes, I prepared contingencies. I reviewed policies. I clarified reporting lines. I ensured that my access and responsibilities were documented, approved, and visible, so they couldn't be quietly rescinded later. None of this required confrontation. It required patience and fluency in organizational language. There's a misconception that power is seized in moments of drama. In reality, it's often claimed in footnotes, in process changes, in who controls the narrative of how decisions are made, not just what they are. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Daniel forwarded me an email thread with a short message. "They want to move forward, let's talk." The role had been approved, with conditions. Not all of mine, not all of his. A compromise that leaned toward oversight rather than execution, influence rather than visibility. Exactly where leverage lives. I accepted without celebration. There was no champagne, no announcement beyond a quiet update in an org chart. People congratulated me politely. Some seemed surprised. Most seemed indifferent. That indifference was telling. They still didn't see me as a threat. They saw the role as an administrative evolution, not a strategic one. And that was fine, because by the time they noticed the consequences, the structure would already be in place. Moving in silence doesn't mean acting without consequence. It means letting consequences arrive before explanations. The first signs were subtle. A decision was delayed because documentation was incomplete. A narrative was challenged because the record didn't support it. A risk revisited because it had been flagged, quietly, clearly, weeks earlier. People felt the friction without understanding its source. They didn't connect it to me. Yet. I wasn't enjoying this. I wasn't savoring it. If anything, I felt more distant than ever. Less reactive, more internal. Power doesn't always feel like control. Sometimes it feels like a responsibility that can't be put down. I knew what was coming. When systems change, the first response is confusion, then frustration, then eventually resistance. And resistance always looks for someone to blame. That's when the consequences begin. Not loudly, not immediately, but in the subtle unraveling of comfort. And once comfort goes, clarity follows. The first consequence wasn't anger. It was disorientation. People began to notice that things took longer. Not because of inefficiency, but because steps that had once been skipped were now visible. Decisions required confirmation. Changes require explanation. The margin for improvisation narrowed. At first, this was framed as a phase. Growing pains, someone said in a meeting. New process, another joked. But discomfort has a way of spreading when it isn't addressed. Leaders who had relied on speed began to feel constrained. Conversations that once happened off the record now leave traces. And with traces comes accountability. Daniel started asking more questions, careful ones. He wanted to know why certain assumptions were being revisited, why previous decisions were being referenced in current discussions. I just want to understand the rationale, he said more than once. I always had an answer. Not defensive, not accusatory, just factual. This was flagged here. This was discussed in this meeting. This assumption changed on this date. Each time, the room went quiet. Not because I was confrontational, but because clarity had a way of freezing momentum. I could feel the shift in how people looked at me. Not suspicion yet, reassessment. I was no longer just the person who executed. I was the person who remembered. That unsettled people. The consequences rippled outward. Teams began double-checking their work before looping me in. Some avoided me altogether, preferring ambiguity over documentation. Others leaned closer, seeking alignment, reassurance. The emotional temperature of the office changed, not dramatically, subtly. Conversations became more guarded, jokes are less frequent. There was a sense that something invisible had hardened, and still, no one confronted me. It's difficult to push back against someone who is simply doing their job, with precision, consistency, and institutional backing. Daniel, however, felt it most acutely. I could see it in how he prepared for meetings now. How did he revise his language? How did he check his facts before speaking? The ease he once had, the assumption that narratives could be adjusted later, was gone. This wasn't punishment, it was exposure. He wasn't losing power, he was losing flexibility. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk and leaned against the partition. This is a lot, he said lightly. All the documentation. I looked up neutral. It's standard for this scope, I replied. He nodded, but his expression tightened. Of course, just feels different. Different was the point. What he didn't say was that it felt like control slipping. Not from his hands entirely, but from the informal spaces where he'd been most comfortable operating. Others felt it too, even if they couldn't articulate it. Decisions that once felt intuitive now required justification. Authority that once went unquestioned now rested on record, not reputation. And records don't respond to charm. I noticed changes in myself as well. I was calmer, less reactive, but also more isolated. There's a quiet loneliness that comes with becoming the point of reference. People are careful around you. Conversations flatten. Humor becomes filtered. I hadn't intended to create distance, but it came with the territory. The hardest part was knowing that none of this was reversible, not without me stepping back into a smaller role. Once systems adapt, they don't easily forget. I had gained influence, yes, but I had also become a mirror, reflecting inconsistencies others preferred not to see. And mirrors are rarely loved. The second consequence arrived shortly after the first. Frustration, not directed at me at first. In the process, at the pace, at the new normal. But frustration looks for form, it looks for a face, and when it finds one, it doesn't announce itself politely. It sharpens, it focuses, and eventually it asks questions that can no longer be answered with neutrality alone. By the time anyone tried to fix it, they were already behind. That's the thing about systemic change. It doesn't announce a turning point. There's no moment where everyone agrees, this has gone too far. Instead, there's a gradual realization that the old shortcuts no longer work, and no one can remember exactly when they stopped working. The panic began quietly, a delayed
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.